myself out here. I spent my spring break down in the Dominican Republic. I came back with a cold and a busted rib from playing too much volleyball. So I may have to just cut my throat occasionally. Maybe I'll prop it up there. So that just tells you never go on vacation. It's a very bad idea. Stay home. Okay, so I want to begin, first of all, by thanking Nico for extending this wonderful invitation to me, and also to the the Center for the Humanities, and also the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies here. And I'm curious how the tone of my talk is going to fit in with the two previous talks. I'm not going to be discussing the nitty-gritty of the coup itself or some of the, I guess, the heavier side of this event, which is, of course, very important that we're discussing now, very timely. I had the first opportunity that I had to meet Augusto Boal. I mean, how many of you here, first of all, are familiar with Augusto Boal? That you've heard of him or you've read some of his work? Okay, a few of you. Well, that's a good thing that I do have a bit of an overview about the author, the playwright himself. And I had an opportunity first of all, in the summer of 2006, when I was leading a study abroad program from University of Georgia to the city of Niteroi. We had a program in the Federal University of Fluminense. And it was very important to me that we develop a service learning component to this program. And I had been able to get Augusto Boal's contact at his Theater Via Press Center in the neighborhood of Lapa, downtown Rio. And so he very graciously invited this group of students and me to come, and we traipsed our way through downtown Rio, and then we arrived in Lapa. And he spent over 2 hours. He, of course, as he would, he created a circle with chairs, and he sat down and he just started to explain to us what the Theater Via Press was. And that led to a very interesting service learning opportunity for several of our students who ended up, they were doing work at a mental hospital in the city of Niteroi. And they were using theater workshops to help remove the stigma of mental illnesses, and using forum theater for that. So you can imagine the kind of memorable experiences that my students had doing improvisations and all sorts of theater exercises in the middle of the mental hospital. That's a very unique service learning. It's not your typical service learning experience. So then our paths crossed again a second time, and as it turns out, unfortunately, a final time, in the summer of 2000 the summer of 2008. And this was shortly after the play that I'm going to discuss was performed at the University of Georgia for the first time, right, in English. It's the play that I translated. And this was in Nebraska, right, at Omaha, at the Theater Via Press, Pedagogy Via Press conference. And I was arriving there with a DVD, a video recording of the play, which I have with me. I hope we'll be able to watch a little bit of it. And some translated scenes that I wanted to present to him and some other people there. And I have to admit that I was not just a little bit nervous about the, as you'll see, some fairly significant tinkering that I had done with his original text. I really wasn't quite sure. I figured he was quite open-minded, but you know, it's one thing to be maybe politically open-minded, another thing to be maybe artistically open-minded. Like maybe he was not okay with me taking such license with his play. But he was at the presentation that I gave, and I left fortunately, Omaha with the green light to go ahead and continue publishing or translating his work, and ideally put together a collection of publications, or a collection of his plays for publication. So I interpreted this as at least a tacit approval of what I was doing with his work, if not somewhat amused maybe by what I was doing. So the preparation of this collection was really my main concern when I returned to Brazil in 2009. I was on sabbatical with my family, and unfortunately in early May I received an email from his son Julian, who also has continued in this work of Theater via Press, indicating to me that his father had passed away quite suddenly from leukemia. He had been struggling with this for some time, but it still really, I think, took people by surprise. And I was literally planning to meet with him that week in Rio to go over some recent scenes that I translated and see if I was on the right track. And it left me with really the overwhelming feeling that my work to bring his corpus of plays to light to an audience outside of Brazil was not only absolutely necessary and incomplete, but something that was really imperative at that point. So let's talk a little bit about Augusto Boal. He was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro. His academic training was actually in chemical engineering, but he attended Columbia University in the late 40s and early 50s, and it was at that point that he started to study drama. His formal involvement in theater in Brazil began in the mid-1950s when he joined the Teatro de Arena, right? It's the theater group in Sao Paulo. And what really, for the first time in the history of Brazilian theater, a theater company was taking its theater to the streets, into the prisons, into churches, into factories, as a means of encouraging dialogue about different forms of oppression. And they were influenced by Bertolt Brecht, right? Boal helped implement what is now known as the Coringa system, right, or the Joker in Portuguese, the Joker system, in which, in contrast to a star system, which you had these sort of big personalities, the actors would, it's kind of commonplace now in contemporary theater, but it was really quite unique at the time, where the actors would switch roles, and the Joker would act as a kind of commentator, encouraging the audience to view the play critically. So throughout the 1960s, under Boal's leadership, the Teatro Arena was arguably the most important theater company in Brazil. And so his plays, for example, Revolution in South America from 1960, The Adventures of Uncle Scrooge McDuck from 1968, his historical satires, Arena tells the story of Zumbi, which I'm also going to talk about, from 1965, and of course here we're getting closer to the military dictatorship period. And then Arena tells the story of Tiradentes from 1967, reflect the socio-political and economic unrest in Brazil during the Cold War, with student protests, socialist movements, spiraling inflation, military dictatorship, and the ever-present threat of neo-imperialism by the U.S. So in 1971, Boal becomes a casualty of this period. He's imprisoned for 4 months, he's tortured, and then eventually exiled in Argentina and Peru, Portugal. He begins this sort of somewhat epic journey through Latin America and then to Europe. He eventually ends up in France, where he really begins to formalize his Theater of the Oppressed. He develops the first center, Theater of the Oppressed there, where he makes use of and divulges his methods. He wouldn't return to Rio until 1986. So Boal elaborated the theoretical basis for his methods in his 1974 publication, The Theater of the Oppressed, which you see here, Teatro do Oprimido, where he challenges the Western theatrical tradition, starting with Aristotle and including bourgeois drama, for shunning political commitment. Instead, Boal argues Aristotle's notion of tragedy's inherent cathartic function and the empathy established between the actor and the spectator resulted in a model that served to purge any impulses, including revolutionary, that threaten the social order. It is also in this book that Boal describes his experimentations with image theater, where participants would, without using words, would create images of prior to, they would take a social, some sort of dilemma, and they would create what this current situation is, and then what the end result is, and then what has to happen in order to get to that place. Invisible theater, this is when actors would create a disturbance in a public space in order to call attention to some issue that they had identified as needing public discourse and discussion. Forum theater, which is probably his best known method, all intended to transform the passive and politically disempowered spectator into the active, politically empowered, and he uses the term spect-actor, right? Giving agency to the spectator. And in so doing, use theater as a means of creating dialogue, rehearsing possible solutions to personal and particularly political and economic dilemmas rooted in social oppression. So a visit to the Theater of the Oppressed official website reveals theater groups and other activist organizations in over 60 countries now. You see here one, they're on every continent. You see here a group in Nepal that's using foreign theater. And India, for example, has one of the largest communities of people making use of Theater of the Oppressed. So Augusto Boal is, excuse me, that tells me I'm supposed to be giving a keynote. Augusto Boal is now internationally recognized for his use of theater as a powerful and empowering tool in the fight for social justice. And I think it's very indicative that in 2008 he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't win it, but and in 2009 he received the title of World Theater Ambassador by UNESCO. So while it is safe to say that the theatrical processes developed by Boal through the Theater of the Oppressed have been widely disseminated, the same cannot be said for his corpus of plays, particularly outside of Brazil. Right? If you ask somebody, well, what do you know about Augusto Boal, they would immediately, Theater of the Oppressed would come to mind. Very few outside of Brazil, even within Brazil, are necessarily familiar with his actual work, his plays. In an effort to shed light on his own artistic production during the military dictatorship years, not only as a theoretician, but also as a playwright, I'd like to talk a bit about my efforts to translate several of his plays into English, namely Arena contra Zumbi, or Arena tells the story of Zumbi, and As Aventuras do Tio Patinhas, right? Translated as The Misadventures of Uncle McBuck, which when it premiered at the University of Georgia in 2008, constituted the very first production that I'm aware of, at least, of a Boal play in English anywhere. And it was was a great opportunity. The play ran for 2 weeks. We had the participation of Julian Boal, his son, leading workshops in theater to be impressed with our students. Doug Patterson, a theater professor from the University of Nebraska, was also there leading some of these workshops. So, prior to discussing the plays themselves, I would like to say a few words about my role as translator in light of a school of thought within translation studies that emerged in Brazil also during the 1960s. It's kind of interesting that this is all happening, sort of converging at the same time as this very tumultuous political period. And this school of thought that has also gained significant international attention within the field. Of course, a perennial debate in translation studies has pivoted around the degree of fidelity to which the translator must bring to their task in relation to the source text. According to a long-standing conservative approach, the authority of the original text remains unquestioned, and the translator's role is that of a faithful transmitter, from a de facto superior source to an inevitably diminished inferior copy. But as early as the 1960s and with vigor during the 1980s, this notion of translation as a mimetic representation of the original was notably subverted by, among others, the concrete poets, theorists, translators, and brothers Augusto de Campos and Haroldo de Campos, these are Brazilian figures. In his introduction to Verso, Reverso, Controverso from 1978, Augusto de Campos writes, with respect to the text he intends to translate, quote, a minha maneira de amá-los é traduzi-los ou degluti-los, segundo a lei antropofágica de Oswald de Andrade, or translated as my way of loving them, or these texts that he is involved in translating, is to translate them, or rather to digest them, following Oswald de Andrade's anthropophagic spirit, right? And of course, he's referring to the Brazilian modernist Oswald de Andrade's Cannibalist Manifesto. So translating as an act of creative absorption and transformation can also be seen in Haroldo de Campos' translation of Goethe's Faust and his self-consciously cannibalistic choice for the title. This is kind of echoing Nico's talk. So his translation of Faust was Deus e Diabo no Fausto de Goethe. And of course here he's making a transparent reference to the Brazilian filmmaker Glauber Rocha's iconoclastic film Deus e Diabo na Terra do Sol. Right? As critic Elsie Ribeiro Pires Vieira has pointed out, quote, the intertext in the very title, right, suggests that the receiving culture will interpenetrate and transform the original one. Translation is no longer a one-way flow from the source to the target culture, but a two-way transcultural enterprise. Right? End of quote. Similarly, Campos replaces Goethe's Shakespearean intertextuality in the Song of the Gravediggers, originally with Shakespeare, with Brazilian poems from João Cabral de Melo Neto's Morte e Vida Severina. For Haroldo de Campos, translation is, and here he's parodying Walter Benjamin's notion of the angelical in translation, a quote, satanic enterprise. Right here, I don't think he means evil. I think he means rebellious. It's a vampire-like transfusion of blood, right, from one culture, one artistic tradition to another. Fidelity is given not to the original source, per se, but rather to the act of transtextual transcreation. Right? A process true to the anthropophagic spirit, whereby the original is deliberately and creatively infused with multiple discourses and native references. Right? Here we have an interesting example of Augusto, his brother's graphic, you could maybe call it a transcreation of Gertrude Stein's poem, right? In which the lines, the words, a rose is a rose is a rose, form the petals of a flower. Right? This is more of a graphic representation of this idea. Of course, by proposing translation as transcreation, Augusto Campos is making a clear political as well as aesthetic statement, right? By breaking down the sacred form of canonic sources, transcreation creates a space for peripheral voices to rewrite, recreate, and reinterpret historical narratives and viewpoints. It constitutes an invitation for marginal voices to interplay with authoritative texts and hegemonic centers. Is the same true? This is posing this question. However, when transcreation occurs in the opposite direction, this is what I had to think about when I was organizing the Luso-American anthology, because we were taking, right, Brazilian texts and bringing them over to sort of the hegemonic center of English and North American publishing culture, right? So when Oswald de Andrade's Cannibalesque Manifesto, or Sosandrides Epic Geza Errante, or Augusto de Campos's Galaxias are translated into English and published in the US, right? And more specifically, this presentation, how does one translate or rewrite the revolutionary content and vision embedded in Augusto Boal's plays from more than 50 years ago, from the 1960s military dictatorship period, for a North American audience in the 21st century? Right? So that was really the challenge that we had. And try to make it mean something to, particularly our UGA students. Let's consider the first play, one that I have only started to work with, but it has posed some really unique challenges. Not the least of which is that it's a musical. I'm not going to sing anything, but I am hopefully going to place some of the lyrics from this play, or some of the songs, which you have on your handout here. So Arena contra Zumbi was a musical written by Gianfrancesco Guarnieri and Augusto Boal, with music by the composer Edu Lobo. And it was performed for the first time in Sao Paulo in May of 1965. So this is precisely on the heels of the golpe. Okay? So that's important to keep in mind. The music tells the story of Quilombo de Palmares and the rise and fall of its ultimate leader, Zumbi. How many of you are familiar with Palmares, the story of Palmares? Right? Yeah. So this is an important episode in Brazilian history, in the history of the Americas, right? It's arguably the largest, Palmares represents arguably the largest runaway slave settlement in the Western Hemisphere, lasting for more than 80 years at its height, with a population in the 1680s, 1690s of upwards to 20,000 inhabitants. Mainly runaway African slaves, but also people who, for whatever reason, were trying to escape urban centers. So it was a very interesting population. So, though the play takes place in the 17th century in northeastern Brazil, the state of Alagoas, to be specific, the opening words of the Coringa, right, make clear the parallels to 1965 and the military's ever-tightening grip on personal and collective freedom in Brazil. Right? So it starts out by saying, História de gente negra, a luta pela razão, que se parece ao presente pela verdade em questão. Pois se trata de uma luta muito linda, na verdade. É a luta que vence os tempos, a luta pela liberdade. Do I need to read that in English? Looking at this group, I will anyway. A story about blacks and the fight for reason that resembles the present due to the truth in question. It deals with a struggle that is indeed quite lovely, a struggle that transcends these times, the fight for liberty. I did this translation fairly quickly. Now you can see I'm trying to pair up lovely with liberty. I'd rather use freedom. It seems seemingly simple, but even História de gente negra is not that easy to translate quickly into English. You know, is it a story about black people? Is it about the, you know, I'd rather use the word negra because Brazilians know what I'm talking about when I say negra. So even that is kind of a little tricky. So it becomes evident, as you can tell here, that Arena contra Zumbi, that in this play, racial conflict per se is not the focal point of the play. The fight of the fugitive slaves in Palma, it is part of it, right? But there's a larger fight in 1965, I think in the minds of Boal. The fight of the fugitive slaves in Palmares, much like that of the Tiradentes conspirators, is intended by Boal to be that of the people, fighting first and foremost against political oppression and despotism. Forged shortly after the golpe in a pervasive climate of increasing political agitation, revolutionary zeal, and counterculture, the play serves as a preamble, for example, to the deadly student protests, the organized strikes, and the police crackdowns that would soon follow in Brazil. It is indeed telling that this play ran for more than a year and a half to sold-out audiences, making it the most successful of the Arena productions, according to Boal. Now, it's hard to imagine, however, producing Zumbi in the U.S., translating it, and then putting on a production, say here at FIU or at UGA or wherever, without race becoming a, if not the, focal point of the play. It would be very challenging, I think. One of the first decisions that a translator-adapter would have to make is whether to leave the play's cultural and historical setting entirely in Brazil. So notwithstanding, and this is all hypothetical because I've only started to work on it. I haven't decided yet. So notwithstanding the historical inaccuracies, shifting the play's setting to North America is tempting in the sense that it would present a provocative rewriting of African slave history in the U.S. A what-if scenario of Palmares unfolding somewhere in the hinterland of Tennessee or northern Georgia, Florida, during the 17th or 18th century. So a hypothetical adaptation of this sort would enable the translator-adapter to introduce to the text language and cultural references specific to African-American culture. So, for example, could work songs or field hollers or the blues replace Edu Lobo's samba melodies? That would be a shame. The music is so beautiful that you'd have to really decide if, or a strategic insertion of modern-day hip-hop. Or is it preferable to leave the text in its original Brazilian setting, allow the audience to establish their own analogous connections? And there's a lot of merit to that as well. So without providing a definitive answer to these questions, I'd like to explore a few possibilities, particularly in light of my earlier discussion of translation as transcreation. Right? So take a look on your handout. The first song that I've included there, it's a song sung at the beginning of the play, and it's entitled Eu Banzo. It's sung by a chorus of slaves during the Middle Passage, right? As Zumbi, a king in Africa, the great-grandfather of Zumbi, urges them to resist, right, the other slaves. He says, as I have here, que faz estes negros parados? Que faz que não quebra este bojo e tira tudo no mar? Right? Why is it that these blacks do nothing? Why don't they crack open the belly of this ship and toss everything into the sea? So the song is their response. And I'll go ahead and play it for you. I think I'm going to have to just play it on my laptop here. As high as I can. So the word banzu, most likely of Kimbundu origin, mibonzu, which means saudade, paixão, right? Saudade, longing, passion, is defined, at least in the Brazilian Weiss dictionary, as, quote, a psychological process caused by deculturalization that would provoke in African slaves being transported to distant lands an initial state of strong agitation, followed by a destructive impulse, and then a profound longing, which in turn would induce apathy, inanition, and at times insanity or death. End of quote. So whatever we make of that definition, it's interesting that the music, how the score kind of recreates that, the stages, at least of that definition of it, right? From very melancholy in the beginning to this sort of agitated, much quicker pacing, and then a kind of return to that slower pace. Now, while this is a word that at least some Brazilians are familiar with, I'm not sure how many, but some, I think, particularly those with a special interest in Afro-Brazilian culture, it's safe to say that very few Anglophones know what it means. Some might, but not a mainstream audience. So during the 19th century, the English term for this particular psychological state was fixed melancholy, or a loss of the desire to live. This was not, however, an uncommon diagnosis during the 19th century. Apparently, even Emily Dickinson self-diagnosed herself as suffering from it. So how best to translate the song then? Right? So despite its accuracy, the awkward diagnostic fixed melancholy is inconceivable as a replacement for banzu. You can imagine, is your fixed melancholy? I don't even know how you do that, right? So given that a large number of slaves destined for North America also came from Western Africa, Angola, as was the case in Brazil, maintaining the term banzu is perhaps preferable, despite its unfamiliarity to modern Anglophone audiences. So note, however, that I've inserted "Oh My Longing" into the repeated verse rather than just saying it's banzu, it's banzu, it's banzu, to clarify the meaning of banzu. And while not a literal translation, this approach does facilitate a two-way transcultural exchange between the original text and the transcreated text. So the song that soon follows El Banzu is entitled A Canção das Dádivas da Natureza, or Song of Nature's Offerings. And this presents a significantly more challenging dilemma for the translator-adapter, as I think will become evident when I play the song for you. Just so you understand the context of it, at this moment in the play, a chorus of fugitive slaves are trying to convince another slave, his name is Nico, no relation, to abandon his familiar life in bondage for the unfamiliar, potentially threatening life of freedom at Palmadas in the wilds of the Brazilian interior. So in response to his question of, well, wait a second, what's out there? The chorus sings this. I don't have the English translation, but you'll get the idea, I think. The handout has more of a verse. So he's looking for he'd rather find like a tame rabbit, you know. And he's a little concerned with all these bichus out there that maybe he's the one that's going to get eaten, right? You'll notice that I've refrained from providing the translation for this one. After prolonged head scratching, the translator is left with a myriad of options, right? None of which are straightforward or obvious. The first would be to get a specialized dictionary with ample botanical and zoological terminology, right? And their variants in Tupi-Guarani to start to fill in the blanks. So if you did that, Pindoba becomes Pindoba palm. All right, what do we have here? Imbiriba is sugar cane. Titara, Jaquitara. Catulé is a palm of the Atelia genus. Pau de Santo, Cabrela, Mahogany, Onça Pintada. Oh, that's a jaguar. That's an easier one. Sussuruna, that's like your mascot here, right? The panther. Guara is a man wolf. I don't even know what that is. It sounds ferocious.
Werewolf.
Man? I don't know.
Werewolf.
It is? M-A-N-E-D. I don't know. A guaxini is a crab-eating raccoon. Preguiça means it's a sloth, right? Tatuperba is a six-banded armadillo. Tamanduá is an anteater. So, I mean, just imagine what this song would sound like. You guys wouldn't even want me to play it. So, how these terms would be rendered again in song with a loose rhyming scheme, the way that this nice bossa nova, you know, melody accompanies, is perhaps anyone's guess. So when we consider other, less faithful approaches to translating the song, and again, I'm not saying this is what I'm going to do, or that even Boal would want me to do, but it's an option, would be to bring us back to the underlying question of fidelity to the original text and to what aspects of the original text, the content, or the form, or the ideological message, must the translator's fidelity lie. So leaving the story of Zumbi within a Brazilian milieu certainly simplifies on one level the translator's task and has the advantage of both preserving Edu Lobo's lush compositions and exposing an English-speaking audience to the historical circumstances of Palmares, which is important, unparalleled in the Western Hemisphere. And yet would the end result approximate the goal that Guarnieri and Boal were seeking with Zumbi in 1965 when it was performed? Namely, to challenge the specific audience to question forms of institutionalized oppression, and particularly the 1964 coup, through a deliberate blending of contemporary references with the history of Palmares. Right? More than likely, upon hearing Lobo's samba-driven Canção das Dádivas, da Natureza, an American audience would, for example, presume that this is what Afro-Brazilian music maybe sounded like in the 17th century. Right? Thus missing entirely the song's forward leap in time and subsequently its anachronic Brechtian impact of critical distancing. Right? So as a kind of transcreative experiment, I'd like to entertain the possibility for the translator of a different option or direction, one that consciously shifts the play's cultural references to a North American context again. It's interesting to speculate, for example, the transcreation that would emerge if one were to use certain lexical and syntactic features of Gullah, the English-based Creole language developed by African slaves living on the Sea Islands and coastal regions of North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia. Right? If you go down to an island like Sanibel Island, you meet these communities, they're living communities. Gullah words, some of which have entered the American English lexicon, such as goober for peanut, and yam, and gumbo for okra, could be used, along with gullah for pig, and nunsi for spider, and tukri, buzzard, for turkey buzzard, right? Not to mention you have folkloric characters such as Brer Rabbit, and Brer Wolf, Brer Alligator, all iconic figures in Gullah folklore narratives. So similarly, incorporating the subversive, self-affirming discourse of hip-hop could also contribute to a critical indigenization of the original text. Okay, so if the intercultural transcreations I have proposed for Arena Conta Zumbi are, at this stage in the project, largely hypothetical, the U.S. production at UGA of Boal's As Aventuras de Tio Patinhas in the spring of 2008 provides a clear example of this intentional blurring between translation and adaptation. So we translated the title into The Misadventures of Uncle McBuck. Tio Patinhas, the Disney character, if you're familiar, right? He was Scrooge McDuck, right? The trick is that we were literally afraid of what Disney might do if we were to put on a play at UGA for 2 hours. Our legal office at UGA probably would have called us up and said, you know, what are you doing? So again, we had to, often your translating decisions are, they're more practical and pragmatic than they are artistic. So written in 1968, Boal's biting and highly caricatured satire takes place during the politically charged late 1960s, presumably in Brazil, although it could be any Latin American country. Following a brief introduction in which, and I have some images here, in which the joker or commentator announces the sudden infiltration of space creatures, you can read communism, in an otherwise utopian society, free of all class struggles. The play opens with Scrooge McDuck, Donald Duck's miserly uncle, paying homage to his god, right, the #1 dime. You can see the image of his dime back there. The dime had a mouth and could talk, which encourages the distraught McDuck to expand his financial empire abroad. The scene swiftly shifts to a kind of amalgamation of Brazil, Mexico, and other third world references. A general climate of political conflict and social unrest unfolds through the rest of the play as an inept and generally infantile president attempts to control the increasingly forceful student and popular protests taking place in the country. So you can see it's dialoguing very clearly with what's happening in Brazil in the second half of the 60s. As events spiral out of control and the threat of alien influences rises, this turns into Michael Jackson's Thriller. The president calls upon the first world's most omnipotent crime fighters and upstanding citizens, the superheroes, Batman and Robin, Superman, Mandrake the Magician. This is kind of the collection of them here. Again, we had to be creative in the labels that we gave to these superheroes. So, what's her name? Narda became Shiraliza, and Mandrake the Magician became W the Decider. Remember, this is 2008. By the end of the play, the government has cracked down brutally with the help of the superheroes on the young, idealistic protesters. The last scene ends with the sound of machine guns and bodies hanging from the ceiling, a foreshadowing of the Brazilian military government's hardening stance soon later, in 1968. Throughout, Boal blends cartoonish fantasy and violent reality, slapstick humor, and biting satire to comment upon the absurdity of a world unraveling due to the Cold War pressures of ideological conflicts, military interventions, and cultural and economic imperialism. As is the case with Arena Conta Zumbi, we can talk about the play's translation on multiple levels that are linguistic, cultural, and socio-historical in nature. So the different options that we had, and I was working with the professor of theater and director of this play, George Contini, we could translate and produce it as a period piece, leaving it in the Cold War era with a Latin American setting, with the 1960s student protests, etc., and let the audience make the connections, or we could transport the cultural references to a post-9/11 world in which the war on terror, rather than communism, overshadows local, national, and international politics. George Contini and I chose the second option. And why did we do that? We felt, first of all, that the ambiguity of the play setting lent itself to this kind of adaptation. More importantly, perhaps, we felt that this approach would resonate more with our younger student audience. And lastly, we had Boal's permission. He knew what we were doing. I was sending him drafts of the translation. Now remember, it's amazing, it's just been 6 years now. But it's amazing how what at the time seemed so urgent and relevant today, the climate has changed. Because, for example, who were the strange creatures invading us then? In 2008, terrorism represented the greatest threat. And the idea of al-Qaeda insurgents planting bombs in our backyards, and you remember the anthrax that was being sent in the mail, had dramatically shaped the rhetorical and political landscape since 9/11. You could argue that there was a culture of fear that was driving a lot of political decisions, a lot of personal decisions people were making. As a result, references to Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, Blackwater, waterboarding, insurgents, etc., appear throughout this translation of Uncle McBuck, as well as obvious Bushisms, right? Throughout the 1960s in Brazil, there was a feeling that the country was on the cusp of a revolution, and the student protests were a manifestation of that. So this sense of impending revolution was perhaps the hardest thing to translate to a relatively privileged American audience in Georgia in 2008. At several moments during McBuck, the actors breaking the third wall essentially directed this question to the audience. What do you want to see changed? And is it my job to try to solve the world's problems? Right? They were directing these questions to the audience. I'd like to end my talk by playing, well, I don't know that I'm going to be able to, and we've kind of run out of time, I think, but I'm not confident that the video is going to play on this. I had some trouble with it this morning. But what you have on your handout there is a song sung by the superheroes as they're being introduced by the president. It provides just one example of the myriad of transcreations on linguistic, lyrical, cultural, and socio-political level that George Contini and I decided upon in our effort to encourage our particular university audience to reflect upon where they stood, if not in the revolution, at least as participants in the collective solving of the world's problems. So perhaps if we have time, we can look at that song. I do want to. So this is the president, and he's getting ready to introduce the superheroes. The original, it's entitled "O Mundo Vai Ser Livre na Porrada." It's good that there are not too many Portuguese speakers here. And note the subtitle, cantada com sotaque bem carregado, pelos super-heróis, right? So then I translated this, well, the world will be free even if we have to bash your head in, sung by the superheroes with a strong gringo accent. So you notice in the Portuguese version, the R